Hello and welcome to another episode of the CG Garage. This is episode number 461, featuring Robert Moggach, who is the co-founder and chief creative at Dashing. Really interesting guy. I've known Robert for many years. It's been a long time since I've spoken to him, so it was really nice to be able to finally catch up and see what he's going on. He is currently in Toronto, but he has been in Los Angeles. I actually met him when we both worked at Method, but he's an incredible guy. He has done many things in CG, as you'll find out from the podcast itself. But I knew him mainly as like a rockstar flame artist, and he did some incredible stuff on the flame. And it was a different perspective for me, honestly, because, I sort of tackled things in a very 3D way, 3D compositing way. That was, the way I did most of my feature films and commercials. And he had a different approach of just getting things done on the flame. And it was really kind of interesting to hear, for me to learn that perspective and see how things are possible. So it was really great to be able to do that. That was, back in the day. So yeah, like I said, Andy's worked at many cool places. He's worked at the Mill. He's worked at the Asylum. He's worked at Digital Domain. He's worked at Method. He's worked on some great films like Harry Potter. And actually, he and I worked on iRobot and Stealth, although I didn't know him at that time. So it was kind of interesting to sort of have that in common as well. Really cool guy. Really appreciate having Rob on and being able to, talk about his amazing career. Okay, we don't have any product announcements, or at least any new product announcements just yet. But if you want to just go to chaos.com, you'll find out any new updates we have there, of course. We do have many events going on at chaos.com/events. Again, chaos.com/events. But there's one that I want to bring you guys a special attention to, and that is Chaos Unboxed Live, that is happening on February 27th. And you can find out more about this at chaos.com/unboxed. It's going to be a live event. There are going to be many announcements happening at that time. Really cool things. So definitely check it out. We will be having some other events following up on Unboxed as well. But the live one will be happening on February 27th. Again, just go to chaos.com/unboxed. And now, of course, if you guys want to know more about the podcast, you guys know what to do. Our main podcast page is chaos.com/CG Garage. You can follow us on Facebook as well, facebook.com/CG Garage Podcast. And if you'd like to watch any of our podcasts, you can always go to our YouTube, which is youtube.com/Chaos Group TV, where we put all our videos, including the podcast itself. But for now, please enjoy episode number 461, featuring Robert Moggach.
Welcome to another CG Garage, where the Chaos Group talks. You'll know it's over when the last bucket drops. We're gonna fire off rays in high dynamic range. We know that ambient occlusion is passé. Global illumination won't lead you astray. And while image-based lighting is really swell, you need to make sure everything has Fresnel.
Okay, Rob, it's actually been a minute since we've seen each other, right? Like at least a decade?
Yeah. I mean, I think the last time I saw you was probably when Scott Metzger was working out of the Chaos office on the early iterations of the Neuralize Atom View software.
Right.
So this is like Culver City. Probably about 8 to 10 years ago.
Yeah. Wow. That seems more recent than I remember. But yeah, that's quite. Yeah. It's been quite a while. I think the first time we actually met each other was at Method. I had just started at Method, and you had just sort of came in at Method for a little bit.
Yeah.
But you and I actually, I was looking at IMDb. You and I worked on several movies that I didn't realize that we both worked on.
Yeah. No, I know. Probably iRobot was one of them, right?
Yeah. And Stealth.
Yeah. Stealth was an interesting one. Yeah. Method. Yeah, I think that's the first time we actually met in person, was at the original Method building with the yellow pillars, the small little, like when it was a little creative studio as opposed to a giant machine.
That it is today. Yeah, it used to be a little boutique place.
Yeah.
People don't realize that. But yeah, I want to get back to your past. Like you've obviously had a long career in visual effects. You've been going back many decades. Like how did this first interest get to you? Like how did it all start for you?
I mean, I started in film school in Toronto, and
Okay.
I was studying. I was in a program called Media Arts, which was film, photography, and digital media. Digital media at that time was like, how do you code a Gaussian blur on a JPEG or what? I can't. It's so long ago. It's sort of like you were sort of learning how to do things, and then in the fourth year of that program, I would sort of specialized in photography, and I was working for a photographer named Ed Bertinsky, who does these incredible, giant, massive shots of like the Yangtze Dam or these quarries and things. And I was a retoucher, using Photoshop before Photoshop had layers. And so early on, digital media was a big part of it. And then when I was in that final year of school, in the lab, I spent a lot of time in the lab, and I was friends with a couple guys in comp sci, and they were like, "Hey, you got to check out this new thing. It's called Mozilla." So I compiled the first version of Mozilla to play with that.
Right.
And then I got this sort of through that, like whatever bulletin board or whatever was going on back then, I can't remember. I got this sort of set of like 35 floppies that was, I think, 3 Studio, right?
Oh, right. It was on floppies. I forgot about that. You have to
you're like, oh my God, I got to download it on my 28.8 baud modem and like install it on my 286. Oh, it's not going to run. I got to get a 386 and all that kind of craziness back then. So then my teacher was like, we're going to start learning 3D software. And I was like, well, I've been playing with 3D Studio. So I ended up teaching the class. But then I dropped out and went to Sheridan College because Sheridan College was the place to go. I had a great portfolio, thankfully, that I was able to get in with another like 15 or 20 students. And this is where like, it's sort of like Cal Arts or what the one that was in Florida at the time is where people were learning computer animation to get into that career. It's where like Steve Williams and all those guys sort of started their career at Sheridan. And so that led into visual effects. And I was trained as an animator, but then I always had the aptitude.
Like a traditional 3D animator?
It was a 3D animation program, but with a classical animation training. So we had one 2D classical, because Sheridan was always known for like creating like Disney animators, 2D classical animators. But then they had this 3D animation program that spun off as a result of that because of the guys that came out of and went to DreamWorks and DreamQuest actually and ILM and those places. And so when I came out as an animator, we started at this company in Toronto, 4 or 5 of us, and the other guys were all classical animators, and I was an animator. We were all good animators, but they didn't have an aptitude for rigging effects and all the stuff that I sort of ended up falling into. And so I started off as sort of like not a TD, but that guy that was like able to sort of try to figure out things, model things, rig things, working in effects on whatever Power Animator and Softimage, which was one piece of software. And then Maya 1.0, like with working with what was it? What was the company? Wavefront. Alias Wavefront was in Toronto, and one of my friends was the
Alias Wavefront. Yeah,
was the first sort of product specialist on Maya, Doug Law. And so I started doing 3D, and I was like, I want to do creative stuff. And the creative stuff for me was animation, but I had all these friends that were classical animators that were sort of doing that work. So I was okay, well, then I got to do that, which was visual effects supervision, flame, and compositing, because that's where I can actually have a control over the image and actually start to be a part of making that final image look good. So then I did flame at nights and supervised a Gene Roddenberry TV series called Earth Final Conflict. And which was a long time ago and like sort of lowbrow visual effects. But back then it was like we were in our 20s and it was like, let's do this. And then I started, like I was always like, even from when I was at Sheridan College, I was seeing the work that was being done in advertising in London specifically, at places like Smoke and Mirrors, Rush's,
the Mill,
Glassworks, early Mill. And so even when I was at Sheridan, every 6 months or so from when I graduated, I was going to London with my reel to say, hey, I'm a young kid who loves this shit. Can I come over here? And there was the earliest iteration of Smoke and Mirrors was a company that I was really impressed by, and there was 3 artists that started that company along with a producer and engineer. Actually 4 artists, but the 3 main artists were the original flame artists from Glassworks, Rushes, and the Mill, and so they all came together as these sort of rock star creative guys to create this company, Smoke and Mirrors, which at the time was a really like inspiring concept because it was artist led. It was the best artists in London. They were creating great work. They had their own sort of challenges with partnership and like 6 people and like whatever happens with business partnerships. But at the time, they created something really special. And so I went over there and worked under them as like a 26, 27-year-old flame artist. And that partnership thing did fall apart. They sort of got taken over by a bigger company. But when that happened, all of these big directors that were working with Smoke and Mirrors at the time still kept bringing work. So all of a sudden I was like given all this giant sort of creative work to work on very quickly in the span of 2 years. And my reel grew, and then Gabby brought me over to Digital Domain, and then I went to Asylum first. Nathan found me, and Nathan brought me over to Asylum.
So you were in London then, and then you moved back to then you moved to LA. Was that your first time in LA?
That was my first time in LA. Yeah.
Okay.
And this is back when like we were treated like, I mean, you probably had some of the same experience. When we started in our career, we were a minority. It was very hard to find people that knew how to do what we do. So like, I remember that I like Virgin Atlantic, whatever, with all the LED lights and stuff. And I was sitting in first class, and Paul Bettany was beside me, and he was moving to LA for the first time. It was like weird, surreal stuff that happened back then because we just sort of lived in that world.
Right.
Yeah, I went to LA, and that was my first experience. Was Asylum, and the amazing energy of that place.
Right.
Then I went back to London. One of those original partners of Smoke and Mirrors, actually 2 of them, had started a company that was doing a lot of just like super small visual effects work with directors like Chris Palmer and Tarsem and Tony Kaye, and just like 3 Flames, a little bit of CG, and I went back and worked for them, and then I came back and worked for Digital Domain.
Okay. Yeah, and did you go into features, or were you working in commercials at DD?
I was working in commercials. It was it was the early days of like, I guess, I think back then HDRI was called Light Wench. Right, which you probably remember, and Chris and like Ron Herbst and John Lima and all this sort of Lightwave crew that was doing sort of early photoreal light rendering. Yep. And we were doing whatever, cars and shiny things, and
that was with I guess Gabby was there, but Ed Ulbrich was also there.
Yeah,
right? So
Gabby, Ed Ulbrich, Karen, who I think is at MPC now, Lisa Baru. There was Mark Kurtz. Mike Pardee. I mean, there's people that have sort of spread out throughout the industry that were all sort of, Mike Pardee and Ed were sort of managing the whole Fincher machine with.
Yeah, Fincher loved DD commercials. Yeah.
I mean, and obviously like Barba and his whole crew were really created a sort of a culture of like innovation at that place. I mean, it trained so many people, and I was only there for 2 years, but like I learned the bulk of what I know about photoreal from that time, right? And this is like this is when Nuke was our in-house compositor. It wasn't a product yet, and so I had the Flame, and I had my Nuke, and I would composite all the CG in Nuke, and then it would pipe into the Flame, and that was just the workflow that would make it look the way it needed to look. So
interesting. Yeah. Well, it was cool. I mean, that was sort of like the heyday, right? In a lot of ways of the early days of how things are working. So what were your thoughts? And is that when you started to get into feature work? Is that DD?
Yeah. Well, I worked on Harry Potter at Smoke and Mirrors in London.
Okay.
So that was probably the first kind of biggish one that I worked on, which was all compositing. It was like doing the invisibility cloak and a few magic wand shots, like when his you get zapped in the butt and his little pigtail grows and that kind of stuff. I remember shots like that.
Right.
But then, at Digital Domain, I wasn't working in the feature department. It was sort of at the end of iRobot and Stealth. Those directors were traditionally commercial directors, and like they got to a point where it was like there's this big stack of shots, and we just need to get a commercial flame artist on this and just get it done. And so I sat with the editor and the director, and just it was the shots at the end when Will Smith is like falling through that AI robot thing, and they just needed a bunch of explosions. And in Stealth, it was like some of the miniature work that was also being shot at DD, but needed just compositing.
Right. It was the planes exploding and stuff that we were working on, right?
Yeah.
That was actually interesting. That was sort of the tail end of DD's miniature department. That was sort of the last two shows that they did miniatures on.
Yep. And I think Les was on that, Les Ecker.
Yeah.
I can't remember who was the name of the guy that was the director, the head of that department.
Fouché.
Yes, Alan Fouché.
Alan Fouché,
yeah.
Who passed away, unfortunately. But yeah, it was a kind of an interesting time. I was thinking about, like, I remember on iRobot when they were doing the explosions for the big thing that there was, and they actually did practical explosions right next door to me because my wall was against the stage, and so it was just constant shaking of the stage as we were trying to work. Yeah,
and that was like I remember that that was one of the shots that I composited when the plane goes right into the cliff, and it was a miniature and it explodes and
that was for Stealth. Yeah.
Sorry, on Stealth, yeah, and that was sort of like we coming from commercials, not having an understanding of color space, not having an understanding of how to get things to look right. That was, I think, that one of the shots where I finally started to go, oh, okay, so this is log and this is linear and this is why it works the way it does. And
right.
Funny how, we just didn't. I mean, we didn't have a clue what gamut was yet.
I know. I had the same thing. It took me the longest time to understand color space, and especially in film, like why it is the way it is, which is now sort of, it seems so weird that I don't understand it. Like, it seems like once you get it, and it seems straightforward, but that initial hump to get to the other side was like, oh yeah, that's why color needs to be this curve.
And like even like gamut for me didn't happen until probably PSYOP, which was like 2014, 2015,
right.
And it was Andy Jones was building the pipeline there, and it was like Stephen Dalala was like really pushing hard on the Clash of Clans stuff for their full CG Clash of Clans commercials, and they were really putting the whole sort of like Aces thing, like the first iteration of what was kind of like an Aces workflow, into the whole pipeline there, and it was the first place I actually sort of started to understand, okay, that's what the importance of gamut is.
Right.
But still, it's hard to, people just don't understand. They don't get it. A lot of people.
Yeah. It was very interesting. I mean, I think, for me, coming as an old CG guy, when I came into DD and I heard about all of these, I think I've mentioned this on the podcast a few times, but I remember hearing about all of these flame artists coming in, right? And they were like the rockstar guys that are coming in, and they had their big suites, and the clients came in and ordered lobster, and those kind of things. And there was a sort of this reputation behind it. And meanwhile, we're in the back dark rooms eating crackers and Diet Coke, right? And it was kind of a different mentality, but understanding the importance of a flame was something that was, a lot of people in the CG world didn't really understand. And it wasn't until I knew they were important in a lot of ways. And it wasn't until I came to Method that I sort of put some of those things in perspective. And meeting someone like you was also a big part of it, right? There's a lot of really great flame artists that were at Method that were really sort of showed what they can do. And one of the things I remember specifically is you were supervising. It was a commercial. It was about water. It was like a bottled water commercial of some kind that was going on.
Yeah, I remember that. Propel.
Yeah, Propel, exactly right.
Yep.
And you, from what I remembered, you created an entire like bird
Yeah.
out of elements of water, all in the flame without any 3D. It was, or you did it all on the flame, which has its own kind of, but it wasn't like no fluid sims, nothing. You just made this entire thing out of elements of water that you found and you've transformed and you sort of created out of nothing. And I was like, this is magic to me. Like, even as someone who understands CG, it was kind of magical. And I started to realize, like, when if a really good operator behind a flame can really just make things happen out of nothing, it's just, it was just incredible. It was when I started to realize, like, what, the vision of a flame artist and how they can sort of be this army of one in a lot of ways.
Yeah, and that sort of goes back to mindset and using tools, right? Like I never, yes, at a certain point in my career, I identified with being a flame artist, right? But
For sure.
But I also I love CG and I loved compositing.
Sure.
I loved Photoshop retouching, and it was just sort of like, for me, I was always looking at, okay, what's the tool to get to there so I can do that, and so that's why my career has kind of been doing all these different things, whether it's CG or compositing or flame, or even like recently I've been doing Resolve color work, and then getting into Unreal and whatever it is. I just sort of I wanted to get to a certain visual, and so if a tool wouldn't do it, I would just find the tool that would do it, and I would learn it. And that was sort of the best thing, is just having that. Like, one of the things I think you probably have it as well, is like, because of the way that the tools were back then, we just learned it. We just figured it out, and we knew that the button was in there somewhere, and we would find it and push that button. And then if that didn't work, we would find another button, or write a piece of code, or ask somebody that was like on that one. I did all that stuff with like the slow motion or elements that were shot by, the director was Andrew Douglas. But then one of our friends was like, hey man, can you export all that water footage? Because I'm doing this water simulation work, Hai Nguyen. And we all know Hai and loved him for his sort of ability to code things. So I think that was culturally what was great about some of the times that we grew up in, was that everybody just wanted to learn and innovate. And
we worked with each other quite a bit. It was kind of fun. And it was kind of nice also. Like, I wasn't involved in that. I had nothing to do with that commercial, but I just remembered I had the ability to sort of walk around, while I was doing stuff, and I just stopped by your bay and I was like, what the hell is Rob doing? It's like, oh my God, and it was just kind of this awesome sort of feeling of seeing that and then understanding, and it was that perspective. And then at the same time, you and I can sit there and chat about where the industry is going, and from our different perspectives, who's going, what commercials are being done, what's happening at this studio. And sort of, it was still, I mean, I think it is still a fairly small industry, but it wasn't as, it was a little tighter back then too. So we kind of had a pulse on everything. Okay. So when you were at Method and you were doing that, but you were going around, you went back to Asylum. So where did all of this sort of land for you in your career?
Where did all of this land for me in my career? So then, Methods. Yeah. You know what? Like, for whatever personal reason, we have our own life challenges, right? And sort of, I think a lot of people in visual effects deal with the fact that we end up working very, very long hours, and it's not necessarily positive for our personal lives. But for whatever reason, I ended up back at Asylum. I think at that time, Method was turning into a much bigger company, and people were asked to make decisions, and I was like, okay, well, I'll just go back to Asylum. Right. Ended up at Asylum.
I kind of did the same. I went back to DD.
Yeah, and whatever. Like, we work for big companies, so it just, that happens the way it happens. And Nathan, with Asylum, always had a mindset of there was certainly some chaos with that place, but it was always about artists first, and like, how do we have great collaborations and create great work. And there was a few studios back then, like what's the studio that worked on The Matrix that I always forget? innovated on.
Mannix?
Mannix, like just sort of some of the cultures and of these places that would
escape is what I think what you're thinking.
So these places that had these incredible cultures of artist-led studios and Rhythm and Hues, obviously. I mean, there's so many that were sort of fell apart because of the nature of our business. I think DD has gone through its iterations and is back there again. From what I've heard, it's in a great place.
Yep.
And some of the original people are still there, which is wonderful. So yeah, I ended up back at Asylum, and then again back to personal stuff. Like I had family in Canada and wanted to, and I had a young family that was. We were like, let's get them to their family. So we moved back to Canada. I started my new business, Dashing, and this is back 2010, and built a tiny little studio that was doing, like, we did some big work, did a 4K stereoscopic full CG project for Cineplex that was fun back then, which was a big deal, learning stereo and building full CG environments with Scott Metzger, Stu Burris, Fabio Zapata was there for us. There was a bunch of people that, like, names that you probably recognize that worked on that project.
Sure.
And it was sort of like a great memory because I was able to bring a lot of people that I had great experiences with into a small studio and work as like a team of 8 to 10 on a project we all loved. So it was, we worked some late nights, but we also listened to some great music and just really bonded with friends. And good memories. And giant data loss, big insurance claim, ended up back in LA.
Really?
Yeah. Yeah, it's funny. It's
wow.
There's actually a great, I don't know if it's still online, but there was a YouTube video about Toy Story 2, and on Toy Story 2, Pixar lost the entire film. I think it was Toy Story 2, and they talk about the data loss, and it ended up that the animator, I think the lead animator, was a woman who was at home on maternity leave, and she happened to have all the animation on her computer at home. So they were able to restore the whole movie and get it delivered on time. So, but this is the stuff that happens. I had a similar experience as a very small company where, like, I had a couple servers that had a firmware bug, and we came in the morning after working till 3 a.m. and watched all our files disappear over the course of the next couple hours. And it turned out that it wasn't our fault. These business things, they take years to resolve. And so I went back to LA to pay for lawyers and whatever. Eventually, it all got taken care of, and I ended up moving on to the next thing.
Wow. Yeah, I've heard of crazy. There was a story, might have been a rumor, I don't know, but I remember someone talking about how during Lord of the Rings, someone was bringing in all the footage to Lord of the Rings for color on their iPod or something like that. It was something very strange, kind of smuggling in this. Like, not, people wouldn't do that today. Like, thank God we have backups. A little better, right?
Well, I mean, it's changed. Like, I've now run so many I ran a film last year almost entirely on Dropbox, which was
interesting,
incredible. I mean, I had like a local mirror, 2 local mirrors, but then most of it was just happening. It's what you can do with gigabit up and down, 2 gigabit up and down internet and fast storage. Suddenly you can.
Yeah, I mean, what is that? Like, how have you thought about cloud and infrastructure, like, in terms of your mobility and your way to do it? Like, is it working out? Has it gotten better? What about the cost? Like, how's the cost changed over time?
It's sort of like I am able to do things with crews around the world, and I haven't really had to, like, I've worked at studios as a freelancer when I'm not running my own business, like worked at Parliament and saw their incredible pipeline, which is all, I think it's all Google based, and it's like 20 plus flames and big data, and it's great. And I've also worked in this way where I have like 5 to 10 artists working in different places in South Africa, in Colombia, and in London, in Toronto, in Montreal, and just collaborating on a Dropbox pipeline.
Right.
And I think it sort of, depending on it depends on the scale of the project and the level of the artist. So senior artists generally can just jump in and get it done, right? Like we're sort of used to like slash job.
Right.
Just show me where the project is, and I'll save things in a way that makes sense, so that I'm being responsible and making sure that. Yeah, I haven't really. And in terms of cost, I keep meaning to build my online pipeline, and I have like the Terraform scripts, and I've started to build my own little like Python base deployment engine. But I always then end up when the project comes, I've got like Flame and Resolve on a Mac Studio, which is amazing. I've got a little storage with Blade storage, which is like faster than any sort of rack-mounted storage I had on Linux Flames. And then I've got a great CG workstation with my like RTX 4090 for Houdini and Redshift, and V-Ray still. I actually do still. I'm not gonna show any bias. And Maya, and yeah, I just sort of get the tools that make sense right now. So I haven't really.
Right.
It depends, I guess, on the studio and what the scale of the deployment is. Like I did some work at Nice Shoes a little bit before the pandemic, and we were running V-Ray to do, and it was all cloud-based. And the CTO at the time was a guy named Robert Keski, and he ended up at Method as the CTO, and he had implemented incredible cloud infrastructure with a few of his engineers, so that you can do that auto deployment of render nodes. And so it just, I guess it just depends on the project. If you have the time, then you scale up and you build it. But for me, I haven't gone the road of building everything myself yet.
I mean, you mentioned the pandemic. Do you think the pandemic really sort of accelerated that process, where it's like, find ways to make it work in some ways?
It definitely did. I mean, I was able to supervise 3 movies at a time at working for Deluxe Method Toronto, just by like having good internet and Zoom. And then what else did I do during the pandemic? I did a CES presentation for Harman that was all Unreal Engine, and that was like Houdini for particle simulations, piping into Unreal for real time, and then I can't remember what the real time system we used for the live presentation that was happening for CES. But there was a big cloud component to that. But I think I ended up, at the time, I had just gotten an RTX 3090, so I ended up doing all the sort of static renders locally because I had fast storage.
Right. Yeah. Yeah, so you just sort of you've always adapted in a lot of ways to whatever the situation is, right?
That's kind of the way I do it. I don't know if it's right or wrong.
Yeah.
It's whatever. Like, give me a problem, I'll figure it out. So.
What have you noticed? I mean, obviously, we mentioned the pandemic sort of changed some of the mentality. What are the other things that you've noticed, obviously, in the last like 5 years or so, that things have sort of changed or made things easier, or just sort of had a different philosophy of how you work?
So I think at the beginning of the pandemic, I started to look, like just before the pandemic, we were starting to look at the power of cloud-based GPU and storage and the cost savings. And then recently I found that there's this sort of, what I have locally for GPU and storage is super fast and giant. And I don't need the cloud, but it's nice to have this sort of hybrid environment where everything's stored in the cloud, so I can easily get it to people, but then I still work locally. So I think that
it's like having a mirror of your own computer on the cloud, so you can just get that mirror and then just keep
and
locally,
like I've definitely become less responsible with my storage management. Because it's
which is the problem when you work locally.
Yeah, but and also when you start to want to do backups and things, it's like, okay, well, I'll just go buy a handful of like 4 terabyte drives, and
right.
you just end up like storing like these, like so many of these things, which are just
Right.
drive backups.
Yeah.
Yeah, I guess it's less of the restraints though. Like I don't feel the restraints that we used to. Like I know if I want to render faster, I can get a faster GPU, but this one's pretty great. I'm getting things out fast enough, and
Right.
the worry of like 8K or 4K, or it doesn't, like I'm just working on source resolution right now for the most part, which is 5K, 6K, not thinking about it. So I think there's maybe it's gone to a bit more of a creative place, but then the deadlines have all shrunk, so that it's less creative. It's just about how do we get it done.
Yeah. And what is that? I mean, what about that part of it? Like, what about in terms of the actual work? I mean, when I was at Method, we're thinking back to 2008 or so. I mean, people were still making $1 million+ car commercials, right? And they were expensive, and Super Bowl stuff was huge, and that's was the bread and butter of a place like Method at the time. And the concept of what a commercial has changed, right? Like people are now making Instagrams more than they're making TV commercials.
Yeah, and I'm probably not the person to ask, because I've
Right.
left that world that we were in, that I was in for many years.
Right.
I sort of just have found this place where I get asked to do creative work on a smaller scale, and it's really enjoyable. And sometimes it's like, can you do a brand exploration for us and just figure out what our brand is from the perspective of our personality and our heart, right? And so I'll do just creative explorations that are just Pinterest with people, and then that might turn into something where, okay, well, we need a full CG reveal of our brand through this sort of subject that I'll come up with. And so, like, in terms of like the large scale commercials, I haven't worked on one of those large scale commercials where I'm working in a supervisor capacity in a while, because I've sort of been given these different projects. So whether it's a brand project, or last year I got asked to work on an indie film which had a big visual effects budget, but not actually do the work, just to work as a supervisor and manage like 3 or 4 vendors that were doing different work.
Okay. What was the project?
That was called Go for Grandma, and it was a recent AFI grad who was working with a producer who named Scott Patterson, who owned a gaming company that did all the back end for all the EA Sports titles. So it was a personal story about that his son wrote. So it was a bit of a passion project, and his son had an unfortunate experience in his parents' divorce. Was with his mother on the East Coast, and wanted to be with his father on the West Coast, which kind of resonated with me personally for various reasons. And this kid's imagination involved dragons and like oceans and storms and all kinds of visual effects. So this producer reached out to me and said, we don't have a great budget, but can you help us with this? And it was actually not a bad budget. It probably should have been 2 or 3 times what it was, but we were able to get the film done and do some big water simulations and CG birds and CG dragon, kinds of things. And that ended up talking about like collaborating with different studios. Axis from northern UK worked on it. Base in China worked on it. A good friend of mine, Ahmed Shahata, who wrote the pipeline for all of our friends at Apple, his studio in Egypt worked on it. Trend VFX, and then studio in LA worked on it, and then I worked on a few shots and just supervised the whole thing. So this is one of those things where, and everything sort of came to, it was Crater in Eastern Europe worked on it as well. They did some great water sim work, and it all came together on Dropbox before it got delivered to light iron for the final online. So it can work.
It's kind of crazy to think about the fact that you can do an entire feature film on Dropbox. Right?
Yeah, there was like 400 shots, and I mean, it could have been done a lot better. There was a lot of deficiencies that as the project grew, and as like some studios weren't necessarily able to deliver on everything, we grew to 5 vendors, and then there was deadlines, and also just an education element to it of just knowing what is possible for a project that involved big water sims and the time that's required for that. So, but it couldn't have been done 5 years earlier. I think that the tools in Houdini these days, and actually the artist that was involved in a lot of the water tools is a guy named Alejandro Echeverri, who he did all the water and blood on Jabaro, that amazing Love, Death, and Robots film.
Right.
So he built water tools. Even though Houdini just came out with their new water system, he had been developing water tools that were really performant, that we couldn't have done the project without.
Yeah. What about all that work that's out there? Like this interesting concepts of what is out there. It's so much more diverse in terms of what is possible. You mentioned Love, Death, and Robots, right? Like things like that happening all over the place where you're getting involved in projects that were not necessarily thought, you didn't think about those a few years ago. It was pretty much commercials or TV or feature films, and that was kind of it. Right?
Yeah. And now there's direct to client, and there's short films, and there's like all this stuff that's sort of, I don't know. I don't really have an opinion. I sort of, I just go by the evidence for me. Like, so
sure.
like obviously there's people that I have friends that have had to go to India or China or Vancouver, Montreal, these places. And I myself, I guess I've gone to Toronto and LA sort of for the last 10, 15 years. But the work for me, I've been very fortunate to always have creative work. And I guess some of that is like mindset stuff, just not operating from a fear place where I need to panic and find a job. It's more just like, okay, as long as I keep my reel up to date and I reach out to the people that know me and trust me and know that I can deliver creatively, something's going to come up. And it's always been the evidence that I have is that like great work, if you're patient, will come to you. So
you mentioned the geography thing, like, right. So geography used to be a problem. Like if you're based in LA, you're based here, you're based. Now that, you mentioned everywhere around the world that you hired all these people to work on this thing, like that's obviously changed with the pandemic too. You didn't have to be in an actual location or so has that sort of changed your perspective on yourself and the talent that you work with as well?
Yeah and no. I think 2 years ago I was much more optimistic about it, and I think that I was like, yeah, we can do anything anywhere, and it doesn't matter where. But then when you work on a project long enough like that, it becomes pretty clear that like the pain point of time zones is
yes.
really hard to get around. You just have to. It's the communication. I ended up like traveling on that project because I had to, just to sort of like do a little bit of like whatever supervisor triage and just make sure that things were on track. And because just the face-to-face interaction or just even having the same time zone interaction, sometimes you just can't get it over Zoom, no matter how many screen captures you do. So.
Yeah, I think it's very interesting. I mean, I have obviously I don't do supervision in the same way, but I have a 10-hour difference between me and Bulgaria, right? Which is where a lot of the people I work with, and that's just very challenging. I only have a couple hours a day that I can just pass information along, and then I have to wait another 24 hours for that to happen again. So it's very hard to think about that. But also I remember when I was at Method and I was working on a title sequence. What was that?
Is that why you go fishing?
No. I go fishing for all kinds of reasons, but there was also, I was working on at Method, I was working on something, and there was the studio was in Paris, and I realized I gave my notes, and then I basically had to wait the next day. I was used to being able to have 2 or 3 reviews a day, and I only had just one, and it's like, I better get my notes in right, because it's going to be a full 24 hours before I get to say it again.
Yeah, no, I mean, one thing I found is that some of these studios have, and it's not a healthy thing, but they, just by the nature of where they are, whatever it is, they have the same fire in the belly that we had. And I find that is some of the challenge with us as an industry is that we created an unhealthy work ethic in our side of the pond, and some of these studios that want the work are willing to do the work at any time of the day just to do it. So that's what we're competing against a little bit with globalization, which I'm not sure if it's a good or a bad thing. I mean, obviously it hurts a lot of our peers and our sort of balance, but it is what it is.
Is there a upside in terms of the amount of work? Are you seeing more work from other places that you would normally see work from, or from other countries and other areas that are much more available to you? Or
I haven't personally, no.
Okay. Yeah.
No, I just I go job to job and give myself, I bill at a rate that allows me to have buffer to find the next thing that is creatively going to be worth working on.
Right. Okay. How long did it take you to figure out what that was? Like how to make that balance? You haven't figured it out, right?
But things seem to be working. It seems to be working. I'm able to sort of maintain a reasonable lifestyle and enjoy the work I do. I think I definitely stopped searching for big paychecks and started focusing more on just what is good work.
Right.
And how do I find that balance in the middle?
And how do you think that, obviously something that we were talking about, we all just figure things out, work on things like, oh, this is interesting. We'll do it this way. We'll do it that way. You mentioned several things that you obviously adapted since you began, like even like GPU rendering, cloud concepts, et cetera. What about now? Like, obviously real time has been a part of it. You've been a part of the real time world. And, just quote unquote figuring it out. Like obviously AI tools have come along a long ways now too as well. Have you sort of explored that area? What are your thoughts on that, and how it, what's the effect it's going to have on the industry or people like ourselves?
It's such a heavy question because there's so many strong feelings about it. The way I look at it is when I first left high school and was in first year university, I was not in film school. I was in a graphic communications management program, which was business for the printing industry. I very quickly, after some psychedelic experiences, realized that I needed to not be a business guy. But what it exposed me to is it exposed me to pre-press and desktop publishing and what it was to have a typesetting computer machine, which was PageMaker at the time. And it also it gave me the exposure to what the transition was from typesetting to desktop publishing to PageMaker, right? And it was similar to the Industrial Revolution. It created a lot of disruption very quickly, and I think it happens in sort of these just long enough ago that we forget about it, and we're in this constant cycle of innovation that we forget about the trauma and the disruption that happens in these cycles. And right now it's happening again with AI, and we're not remembering what happened just 20 years ago, 30 years ago with prepress and how it revolutionized design, even like graphic design and designers having to do things by hand. So it's a lot of people are going to lose their jobs, and a lot of people it's going to create new jobs. And I think the only thing, like I say all this and I make these parallels, but then it doesn't address the sort of bigger thing, which is it's happening so quickly. Like the innovations that happened in the last 4 weeks as opposed to the last 4 years, right? Like it just happens that much faster that how do we societally keep up with that? I don't know.
Well, how's it going to affect? Like, I mean, it's got to be something that, just just think about this, right? Like, if someone had come to me and said, back in the day when you were creating that bird for the commercial out of water, I would have said, okay, in order to bid this, we're going to have to create a CG bird. We're going to have fluid sims. We're going to have to create skeleton. It's going to be expensive. And then you're like, no, I'm just going to figure that out on Flame, and it's going to take a bunch of water elements in slow motion and sort of, collage them together into this bird. And it looked way more convincing than I could have done back then, right? Even so. And nowadays I would say, well, just type in water bird.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. And then I'll just use some other tools, just like make it move,
Yeah.
And would have been done.
I think you're right. And I think there's also, like, I find that, like, the tools are really good, but they're not quite there yet. But then I also see stuff like what Chris Smallfield is doing.
Yeah.
And it's like, okay, well, he's obviously putting the time in to get those results because it's great. But I don't, like, I get good results as well, and it's sort of hit or miss sometimes. I'm very curious to see what happens when we see the next generation, if we get there, the next generation of LLMs and image models and
sure.
I remember there was a great interview with the founder of Midjourney shortly after they had launched, and he was talking about what's next, and he was like, well, in 3 or 4 years, I'm guessing we'll be able to have, like, real-time video generation based on a user's data, so we can have, like,
sure,
personally curated videos that sort of give us what we need to get the fix that we need on a short scale, maybe like a 3 or 4 minute video that is exactly what I need to hit my serotonin dopamine.
Yeah.
So I don't know, like, where it's going. Like, I think we're all sort of wondering, and I don't have the answers, that's for sure.
I think it's interesting. You mentioned Chris Smallfield, and there are several other examples like that. Chris, and obviously you and I knew Chris from Method back in the day, but yep. You're right. He is taking the time to sort of understand and foster and nurture that learning curve that is involved. And there's a misconception that there is no learning curve. You just type in whatever the hell you want, right? Mm-hmm. But you're obviously seeing much more interesting results from people that do take more time to do this thing, right? Like, I've seen it with my friend Eric Sheely, and I've seen it with other people like that are like, that's a style that is clearly, I know it technically comes from whatever system they're using, either Midjourney or Stable Diffusion or whatever, but it's like, it's clearly of something that is a style that they have that's being put on that's not necessarily the same thing that you see everywhere else. And so I'm just curious of, like, how that's going to, like, who are those going to become the next Houdini artists, or the next Flame guy that's, shipped on on Virgin Atlantic with all the neon lights inside in first class and getting champagne. You know what I mean? Like, is that going to be that person, the next one of those people right now?
I don't have the answer to that. I think you probably want to talk to the founder of OpenAI and see what they're hiring.
I've been trying, by the way. I have. If you happen to, anyone knows the contact information, I did send them out some invitations on LinkedIn and stuff, but right. I didn't think they'd responded to me. But yeah, I'm curious about those things. I'm also, honestly, I'm also very curious about, to talk to people like Carla Ortiz, who's dealing with a lot of the specific copyright lawsuits that are going on right now, and sort of understanding how that's going to work out. Mm-hmm. I am strongly believe that these things need to be explored, but I strongly also believe that they need to be explored in a court system, which is what Carla is doing, as opposed to court of public opinion, which I think we deal with way too much. And I'm very excited about that journey that people are going through. I don't know what's this going to do for us, or how this is going to affect our livelihood, but I know that the interest in CG has gone way up because of it, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it gives you the amalgamation of all the images that are out there. It doesn't give you the images that aren't out there.
Right.
I think there's still...
Well, by definition, it's only going to give you results that it's the most predictable results.
Yeah,
right?
and based on everything that you could possibly give it, which is a huge data set that we can't comprehend
Sure.
in our brains. But I don't think it doesn't give us real, true, original work yet. It's cool and it's very original. It looks very original, but I don't think it's going to give you like completely original concept yet. I think maybe the next LLM may get there. What are they saying? It's like we're on 4 right now, but like version 6 is where it'll have the same number of neural pathways as the human brain, and then we can start to...
Yeah, but that's a bullshit term because who knows about that? That's not this. A neural pathway on our brain is not the same as this.
Yeah, I mean, and then you get into sort of quantum physics, and there's a great writer named Sean Webb. You should look him up, and he started his career as a hardware provider or hardware engineer working for Silicon Graphics, providing Onyxes to Area 51, and he developed his own sort of algorithmic understanding of human emotion, and he's convinced that if that was implemented into ChatGPT, that we would have a much more powerful system for handling what we're going to go into over the next 10 years. I mean, that just scratches the surface of what he does, but there's I don't know. We're observing. We're observing.
Absolutely. I think it's, you mentioned it's like, it's not necessarily a very original thought, but honestly speaking, even before any of this stuff, I haven't seen really good original thought from 2000 to 2019. There wasn't much originality going on in the world. Yeah. We were very stuck in a specific way of looking at the world that we kept repeating over and over and over again that made us feel safe and secure. And I think that what I've seen, even though it's all based on other things, like it turns out when random people use these tools and make things, they have very strange things in their head that they're able to finally express visually.
I definitely got some interesting results out of combining things I would never thought of combining. Like I do love the idea, but it is all derivative of something else.
It is. Well, isn't it? I mean, yes. I mean, you can always go through the argument. Everything is kind of derivative.
So you said 2000. I'm gonna say no, because I just looked up when did Inception come out, and that was a movie that I loved to watch, and that was 2000.
Okay, so that's 2005,
2010.
2010. Okay, sure.
But I agree. Like even if we look at music, right? Like where was music in the 70s and 80s versus where we are now?
Yeah, I was mostly going about. Well, in the movie sense of things, I think Inception was an interesting one. There are definitely exceptions, but for the most part, after 9/11, I think that everyone got scared and sort of brought, like, we're just going to do superhero films, right? Yeah. Everyone is a hero. We just need heroes at this point. And everyone sort of didn't go beyond that. And in fact, if you look at, and then I was always sort of joking about it with people, when you look at ArtStation before the AI boom, if you looked at ArtStation, it was mostly just Iron Man suits and girls with giant swords. That was it. That was most of what people were creating on ArtStation. And it, there was a few other things. Obviously, there's always going to be a few other things, but you didn't see this plethora of just like crazy things out there that people wanted to express visually that was different,
Yeah, and even like just looking at my own like reference library and thinking about that, like I used to maintain a really big reference library of stills that I loved, and I curated it, and like it was like a photographer from here or an illustrator from here or like this painter and that sort of it all just there was definitely a homogenization of our entire sort of visual input over the last 20 years that just is not very inspiring. It's hard to get to that inspiration. for sure.
I think my main issue is that it's hard to curate things a little bit, right? Because like I work with Eric Sheely a lot, and we're doing some creative projects together, which is great. And we were talking about, creatively speaking, like how do we want to get something to look and just sort of get some concepts out for something. And in the course of a 1 hour, while we were talking, he generated 500 images of different reference. All of them were very like pretty close to what we wanted, and it was like. We didn't even get out of the meeting. The point of the meeting was to like have a meeting to talk about what you want and then generate it. We were still in the meeting and there were already 500 images that were generated.
Yeah, I've had that same experience. Like,
right.
And just with a little bit of Photoshop, you're like, okay, that's it. There it is.
That's it. Right.
There's the poster.
Yep.
Yeah.
So it's very, very interesting to sort of think about that. And even if it's not the poster, even if it's not the original art that you created, even if it's just a stepping off point that you want, which honestly, a lot of times we do, right? A lot of times when you look at feature films and how they're created, and in terms of quote unquote inspiration, they often take stills from other movies to use as inspiration for what they're trying to do, right? So
yeah. So who was it that said there is no original art?
I don't remember. Was it probably Andy Warhol or
like Warhol or Dali or someone like that?
Which, by the way, Warhol is being sued. The Warhol Foundation is being sued for copyright, which could have an effect on the AI art, right?
Wow. I was going to bring up Warhol because that's such a great. He was making that statement.
Yeah. Yeah. Or you can even look at Duchamp, for God's sakes, with the fountain, right? He was making that statement. That was in the 20s or 30s, right? So, yeah. Interesting. Well, listen, it's really cool to catch up with you and see you again, man. I mean, hopefully, you said you come to LA often, so next time you come, let me know, and we'd love to hang out with you and see how you're doing. I remember your son and my daughter were almost the same age, so thinking about,
my daughter 14.
17. She's 17 as well, yeah. And so, like, she's graduating high school, and I'm thinking, it's like, wow, your kid's probably graduating high school too. Getting along the same line. So, yeah, it's interesting to see that. Well, listen, man, it's great talking to you. I appreciate you being on, and keep up the amazing stuff that you're doing.
Thanks, Chris.